They called her the laziest girl in 3 counties, while every farmer in Washita County hitched their mules at dawn and turned their soil until it lay soft and dark and neat as a quilt. 17-year-old Willa Harper stood at the edge of her family's wheat field with her arms crossed and said the 5 words that would make her the laughingstock of western Oklahoma. "I'm not plowing this land." It was the spring of 1931. The rain had already started to forget about Oklahoma, and in a place where a man's worth was measured by the straightness of his furrows, a teenage girl refusing to plow wasn't just strange. It was scandalous. The men at the feed store laughed about it for weeks. Her own uncle said she'd shamed her daddy's name. The neighbors' wives whispered that the Harper girl had gone soft in the head, that all those books she read had addled her brains like an egg left too long in the sun. But 4 years later, when the sky itself turned black and the worst drought in American history buried those neat, straight furrows under mountains of drifting dust, those same men would stand at Willa's fence line with their hats in their hands, staring at the only green fields left in the county. And they would ask her the question she'd been waiting 4 years to answer. "How'd you do it, girl?" This is the story of a 17-year-old who was called lazy, crazy, and worse, and the secret she discovered in the soil beneath her feet that would outproduce every farm in the state. But to understand why Willa Harper refused to plow, you have to understand what plowing meant to the people of Washita County. And to understand that, you have to go back to a cold February morning in 1931, 3 months before she spoke those 5 scandalous words, when Willa found her father sitting alone in the dark kitchen with a letter from the bank. Elias Harper was not a man who cried. He had buried 2 sons in the influenza year of 1918 and hadn't cried at their graves, though his hands shook for a month after. He had worked the same 240 acres since he was 19 years old, through hail and grasshoppers and wheat prices that fell like stones down a well. He was 53 years old, and his hands were so gnarled from the plow handles that he couldn't straighten his fingers anymore. But that February morning, when Willa came down for breakfast, her father was sitting at the table with his face in those broken hands, and the letter from the First National Bank of Cordell lay open in front of him like a wound. The farm was behind on its note. 2 seasons of poor prices had eaten the savings. 1 more bad year, the letter said in polite, typed language, and the bank would be forced to pursue other arrangements. Everyone in Oklahoma knew what other arrangements meant. It meant the auctioneer's gavel. It meant watching strangers walk off with your grandmother's china and your mules and your land. It had already happened to the Wilcoxes down the road and the Pruitts and old man Hennessy, who'd farmed his section for 40 years. Willa read the letter twice. Then she looked at her father and said, "Papa, how much do we need?" $400 by harvest, he said. Might as well be 4,000. $400 in 1931 in Washita County. That was the price of a farm. That was the price of everything they were. "We'll get it," Willa said. Her father looked up at her then, and what she saw in his eyes wasn't hope. It was the particular exhaustion of a man who has worked himself to the bone doing everything the way he was taught and watched it fail anyway. "Girl," he said quietly, "there's only one way to get it. We plow every acre we've got this spring, every last one. We plant fence to fence. We squeeze this land like a rag until it gives us one big crop, and we pray the price holds." Willa didn't argue, not that morning. She just stood there looking at the letter, and something cold and certain settled into her chest. The feeling you get when you watch a man walking toward a cliff in the fog, and you can see the edge he can't, because Willa Harper knew something about that fog. She'd been studying it for 2 years. ever since the summer she turned 15. Ever since she'd found the book that changed everything. It happened the summer of 1929 at a church rummage sale in Cordell. Willa had been digging through a box of donated books, mostly Bibles and almanacs, and a waterlogged romance novel, when her fingers closed on a thin, plain-bound volume with a title so dry it could have blown away on its own, Soils and Soil Management. She almost put it back. Almost. But something made her open it, and there on the third page was a sentence that stopped her heart the way only true things can. The plow is the most destructive implement ever devised by the mind of man. She stood in that church basement for an hour, reading. She read about how the Great Plains had been grassland for 10,000 years. How the buffalo grass roots went down 6 feet, 8 feet, holding the soil in a living net. She read about how the sod had been broken by the steel plow in a single generation, how the exposed soil, loosed, pulverized, laid bare to the sun and wind, was not farmland at all anymore, but dust waiting for a wind to carry it. The author had a word for what was coming. He called it a dust bowl. Willa paid a nickel for the book. She read it 11 times that summer. She underlined passages until the pencil wore through the page. And then she did something no one else in Washita County had done. She walked out into her father's fields, knelt down, and actually looked at the soil, not at the crop, at the soil. What she found frightened her. The top 2 inches were gray and lifeless, powdery as ash. When she squeezed a handful, it didn't hold together. It streamed through her fingers like sand through an hourglass. There were no earthworms, no root fibers, no smell. Good soil, the book said, should smell alive, sweet and dark like coffee grounds. Her father's field smelled like nothing at all. That was the summer. Willa Harper understood that her father, a good man, a hard-working man, a man she loved more than anyone on earth, was farming his way straight into ruin, and that every pass of the plow was sharpening the knife. But knowing a thing and convincing a county of a thing are 2 different animals entirely. When Willa first tried to tell her father what she'd read, he listened the way fathers listen to 15-year-old daughters, with patience and no intention of being moved. "Willa," he said, "my daddy plowed this land. His daddy plowed land in Tennessee. The good book itself says to break up your fallow ground. You telling me the Bible's wrong? I'm telling you the ground's dying. Papa, the ground," he said, "is ground. It's been here 10,000 years. It'll be here 10,000 more." He said it kindly. He even patted her shoulder. And Willa understood, standing there in the barn doorway with the evening light coming in sideways. That kindness was going to be the hardest wall she'd ever have to climb. So she stopped arguing, and she started scheming. All through the fall of 1930, while her father plowed the east 140 acres for winter wheat, Willa worked a quiet plan. The Harper farm had a 40-acre piece on the west side, the Old 40. Everyone called it. That had been played out and mostly abandoned. It grew scrub and weeds in a little thin pasture. Nobody wanted it. Nobody watched it. Willa asked her father for it. "For what?" he said. "A garden," she said, "a big one. Truck crops for the Cordell market. If I make any money, it goes to the note." Elias Harper looked at his daughter for a long moment. She was tall for a girl, with his same dark eyes, and her mother's stubborn jaw, and she had that look she got when she'd decided something and the whole world would have to move around it. 40 acres isn't a garden, Willa. Then call it an experiment." He almost said no. She could see it forming on his face. But the bank letter was never far from his mind, and a daughter offering to work abandoned land for free was not an offer a desperate man refuses. "The Old 40's yours," he said. "But hear me, the East 140 gets plowed and planted proper, my way, and you help with it same as always. Your garden is extra. You do it on your own time, with your own back." And Willa, he held up one crooked finger. "You will not make a spectacle of this family. We have enough troubles without the county talking." The county talked anyway. The county always talked. But that winter, in the cold months when farm families sat by their stoves and shelled corn and waited, Willa Harper worked. She walked the old 40 in the freezing wind, studying it the way a doctor studies a patient. She read her soil book by lamplight until her mother made her stop. She wrote letters, actual letters, with postage she earned selling eggs, to the agricultural college in Stillwater, asking questions that must have seemed very strange coming from a farm girl in Washita County. And to her amazement, a man wrote back. His name was Dr. Henry Colson, and he was an agronomist at Oklahoma A&M, one of a small, ignored fraternity of scientists who had been shouting into the wind about soil conservation for years. He wrote to Willa in a careful, delighted hand, answering every question and sending her bulletins she'd never have found on her own. Bulletins about cover crops, about legumes that pull nitrogen from the air and feed it to the soil, about leaving crop residue on the surface instead of plowing it under, about an idea so radical it barely had a name. They called it trash farming. Leave the stubble. Leave the stalks. Never turn the soil at all. Plant into the residue and let the dead plants armor the living ground against the sun and the wind. Most farmers who heard about it laughed. A field covered in dead plant trash looked like a field nobody tended. It looked lazy. That was the word that would follow Willa Harper for 4 years. Lazy. But in the bulletins, Dr. Colson wrote something that Willa copied onto the first page of her notebook in letters an inch tall. The soil is not a factory, it is a body. You do not strengthen a body by cutting it open every year. In February of 1931, Willa made her decision. She told her mother first, because Ada Harper had a soft heart and a sharp mind, and because Willa knew she'd need an ally inside the house. "Mama," she said, "I'm not going to plow the old 40. I'm going to plant it without turning it, and I'm going to need you to not tell Papa until it's done." Ada Harper looked at her daughter for a long time. Then she said the most motherly thing a mother can say. "You're going to give your father a heart attack." "Maybe," Willa said. "Or I'm going to save his farm." Spring came to Washita County the way it always did, with wind and mud and the smell of turned earth. Up and down the section lines, the plows went out. Elias Harper plowed his East 140 with his team of mules, Bess and June, and Willa helped because she had promised. Walking behind the harrow until her boots were caked heavy and her shoulders burned, and in the hours before dawn and after supper, on her own time, with her own back, she worked the old 40 her way. She did not plow it. She did not disc it. She did not harrow it smooth. Instead, she did things that made the neighbors slow their wagons down to stare. She planted cowpeas, which everyone knew were a poor man's crop, a nothing crop, and when they came up green, she didn't harvest them. She knocked them down flat with a drag made of old fence posts and left them lying on the ground like a fallen army. She planted Sudan grass and let it grow waist high and knocked that down too. She hauled every scrap of old straw and cornstalk from the barn and spread it over the field until the old 40 looked like the floor of a barnyard. And then, in the first week of April, with her mother holding the team and her own hands guiding the single-row planter she'd modified with a heavier disc to cut through the residue, Willa Harper planted her crop straight into the mess. Corn on 12 acres, sorghum on 20, cowpeas again on the rest, drilled between the rows. The first neighbor to see it was Harley Dunn, who farmed the section to the north and considered himself the county's authority on everything. He pulled his wagon up at the fence line on a Tuesday morning and watched Willa for 10 full minutes before he couldn't hold it in anymore. "Girl," he called out, "you forget how to plow, or you just too lazy to do it." Willa wiped her forehead with her wrist. "Morning, Mr. Dunn. Your daddy know you're planting into weeds and trash? It's my 40. You're 40. Harley Dunn spat into the road. "Field looks like a tornado's junk pile. I ever tell you what my daddy said about a dirty field? Said a dirty field is the sign of a dirty character." "Well," Willa said, "I guess we'll see come harvest." Harley Dunn laughed all the way down the road. She could hear it after he'd passed out of sight. By the end of the week, the story was everywhere. It traveled from the feed store to the barber shop to the church steps. Elias Harper's girl was farming 40 acres without a plow, planting into garbage, let the weeds grow, knocked her crops down on purpose. Lazy, some said. Addled, said others. The kindest version was that the girl was too proud to admit she couldn't handle a plow, so she'd invented an excuse. The cruelest version came from the Callaway boys, 2 brothers in their 20s who had never liked Willa, since she'd outread them in the county spelling bee when she was 12. They started calling her Willa the Weed Queen. They said it loud, in town, where she could hear. At Sunday dinner, her Uncle Roy, her brother who farmed 300 acres and never missed a chance to say so, leaned across the table and said, "Elias, you got to put a stop to it. People are laughing. They're saying the Harpers have gone queer. It's a shame on the name." Elias Harper chewed his food and said nothing. That night, he came out to the old 40, where Willa was checking her seed rows by lantern light. He stood at the edge of the field for a long time, looking at the residue-covered ground, at the corn just beginning to spike up green through the straw and the fallen cowpeas. "It looks a wreck, Willa," he said finally. "It looks like nobody loves it. I know, Papa. Roy says you're shaming us. I know." He was quiet so long she thought he'd gone. Then he said, "The East 140 came up good, clean rows, pretty as a picture." He paused. "I keep waiting to feel proud of it. Mostly I just feel tired." He walked back to the house without saying good night. But he didn't tell her to stop. And in the Harper family, that was as close to a blessing as Willa was going to get. What Willa couldn't have known, standing in her wreck of a field that April night, was that the sky over Oklahoma was already changing, that the rain, which had been growing forgetful for 2 years, was about to leave entirely, that the neat, clean, pretty furrows her father was so tired of plowing were about to become the most dangerous ground in America. The summer of 1931 was hot. The summer of 1932 was hotter. The rain came in teasing little spurts, a 1/4 inch here, a 1/2 inch there. Never enough to wet the subsoil, always enough to make a man hope. And a strange thing began to happen on the old 40. In June of 1931, the county got a single thunderstorm, a real gully washer, 2 inches in an hour. On every plowed field in Washita County, that water ran off in muddy rivers, carrying the topsoil with it, cutting gullies through the neat rows. Elias Harper stood at his fence and watched a foot of his best field wash into the road ditch, and Willa watched him watch it, and neither of them said anything. On the old 40, the water didn't run. It couldn't. The mat of straw and dead cowpeas slowed it, spread it, held it until it sank. When Willa walked her field the next morning, the soil under the residue was dark and wet 8 inches down. She pushed her arm into the ground up to the elbow, into cool, living earth, and found earthworms. Fat ones, dozens of them, where 2 years before there had been none. She put one in her pocket and carried it back to the house like a treasure. Her mother pretended to be disgusted. Her father looked at it a long time and said only, "Huh." That fall, the old 40 made 22 bushels of corn to the acre. It wasn't a miracle. A good year on good plowed land might make 30, but the East 140, the pretty field, the proper field, made 19. Willa didn't say a word about it. She didn't have to. Numbers have a way of speaking for themselves, quietly, in the back of a man's mind. She sold the corn and the sorghum and the cowpea seed. and she put $91 in a coffee can and gave it to her father for the banknote. He took it without comment, but that night Willa heard him ask her mother in a low voice through the bedroom wall, "Where'd she learn that?" "From a book, Elias," her mother said. "You know, those things with pages." Willa smiled in the dark and slept like a stone. The winter of 1931 into 1932, she wrote to Dr. Colson twice a month. He sent her more bulletins and seeds, little paper packets of things she'd never grown, sweet clover vetch, a strange grain called Milo. He wrote, "You are doing in one season what takes our test plots 3. The plains have been farmed like a mine, Miss Harper. Take out the crop, put nothing back. What you are doing is farming like a garden. Feed the soil, and the soil will feed you. But I will warn you, the drought that is coming will test everything you believe. The drought that is coming." He wrote it like a fact, like a train already on the tracks. Willa believed him. She doubled her cover crops. She talked her father, talked and talked, all winter, chipping at him like water on stone, into letting her leave the wheat stubble standing on 20 acres of the east field instead of plowing it under. Just 20. A test. Harley Dunn saw the standing stubble in March and nearly drove his wagon into the ditch laughing. But nobody was laughing by the summer of 1933, because that was the summer the wind woke up. The first big duster came on a Thursday in May. Willa was in the old 40 when she saw it, a wall on the western horizon, red-brown and boiling, rising 10,000 feet into a sky that had been blue 10 minutes before. It came on like a freight train, and the sound it made was not a wind sound at all, but a roar, a deep, continuous roar, like the world tearing in half. She ran for the house. Her mother was already wetting towels to stuff under the doors. Her father came in from the barn with Bess and June wild-eyed behind him, and the 4 of them sat in the kitchen in the dark, at 2 in the afternoon, while the dust hissed against the windows like sand through a hose. It lasted 3 hours. When it passed, they opened the door onto a world they didn't recognize. The sky was yellow. The fence posts wore dust drifts like skirts. The East 140, plowed clean that spring, neat as a quilt, was simply gone. Not buried, gone. The topsoil had risen into the sky and left for Texas, and what remained was hard, pale subsoil, dead as concrete, with the wheat lying in withered rows like hairs on a skull. Elias Harper walked out into his field and stood in the middle of it for a long time. Willa watched him from the fence. She didn't go to him. Some griefs a man has to stand in alone. Then she walked to the old 40. The dust had drifted against the residue, caught in the stalks and the straw, and the field wore a thin coat of new soil. Soil stolen from her neighbors' farms, from her father's farm, from farms 100 miles west. But underneath, her ground was intact, anchored, held by roots and armor and 2 years of stubbornness. She knelt and dug with her hands, and 3 inches down, the earth was still dark and faintly damp. She sat back on her heels in the ruined light of that yellow afternoon, and she cried for her father's field, for the Wilcoxes and the Pruitts and old man Hennessy, for all the neat, straight furrows in the world and the men who loved them. And then she wiped her face, stood up, and went to find her father, because there was work to do and the wind was not done with Oklahoma yet. The years that followed had a name before they were even over. People called them the Dirty 30s, the Dust Bowl. The government in Washington sent men with cameras and notepads, and the men wrote reports with words like catastrophe and unprecedented. The year 1934 brought almost no rain at all. The year 1935 brought Black Sunday, the 14th of April. A duster so vast it turned day to night from Kansas to Texas, so thick that birds fell dead out of the sky, so dark that people in the middle of it couldn't see their own hands. By then, half of Washita County was gone. Not damaged, gone. Farms that had been families for 50 years stood empty. Their owners headed west on Route 66 with mattresses roped to their trucks. Harley Dunn left in the fall of 1934. Harley Dunn, the authority on everything, whose 300 acres of clean plowed ground had blown away to the hardpan in 3 seasons. He stopped at the Harper place on his way out, the first time he'd stopped in 4 years. Willa was at the fence. He didn't get down from the wagon. "Your daddy inside?" he asked. "He is." Harley Dunn looked past her at the old 40. It was August, the driest August anyone could remember, and the old 40 was green. Not lush, nothing was lush in 1934, but green standing alive. Sorghum head high, cowpeas vining through the residue, the only green field on the whole section line. "How?" he said. "Just that, how?" "The soil's alive, Mr. Dunn," Willa said. "It drinks what little rain comes and holds it. The cover keeps the sun off. The roots keep the wind off. It isn't lazy, it's just quiet." He looked at her for a long moment, this girl. She was 20 now, lean and brown as a fence post, and something moved behind his eyes that might have been shame and might have been grief. "My daddy said a dirty field is a dirty character," he said finally. "I remember he was wrong," said Harley Dunn, and he slapped the reins and drove west, and Willa never saw him again. The story might have ended there. A vindicated girl, a saved farm, a lesson learned. But Willa Harper wasn't done, because vindication was never the point. The point was the $400. The point was the farm, and the farm was not saved yet. The banknote had been rolled over twice, extended on the strength of the old 40's yields, but in the spring of 1935, the First National Bank of Cordell called it due in full. The dusters had broken the bank too. It needed cash, not promises. Elias Harper had until the 1st of November. This time it wasn't $400. It was $1,100. Willa did the arithmetic in her notebook by lantern light, the way she'd done everything since she was 15, carefully, on paper, where a thing can be looked at from all sides. The old 40, even performing like a miracle, couldn't carry it alone. She needed the whole farm working her way, and she needed it now, in the worst drought in recorded history, with a father who had spent 4 years watching her be right and still couldn't quite say so out loud. She found him in the barn, oiling the plowshares out of habit for a field too dead to plow. "Papa," she said, "give me the whole farm." He didn't look up. "You have the old 40. Give me the East 140. No plow, we list the sorghum into the stubble. We plant cowpeas and clover on the worst of it. We let the land doctor itself. 1 season, my way, the whole place. And if you're wrong, then the bank takes a farm that was already lost," she said. "But if I'm right, Papa, if I'm right, we pay the note, and Washita County learns something it's going to need to know for the next 100 years. Elias Harper set down the oil can. He looked at his hands, the crooked fingers, the plow handle calluses, 53 years of doing it the way he was taught. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. "Your mama says you've been right about everything since you were 12 years old. Mama exaggerates." "She does not," he said. And then, for the first time in 4 years, Elias Harper said the words his daughter had been waiting to hear, "Show me what to do." They worked that farm like the end of the world was coming, because it was. Father and daughter, side by side, listing seed into standing stubble while the dust storms rolled over them like waves over a ship. Neighbors who hadn't left yet drove out to watch, the way people watch a house fire. The Callaway boys, before they lit out for California, stood at the fence and hooted, but there was no real spirit in it anymore. Mockery needs an audience, and the audience was gone. Ada Harper kept the books. Every rainfall measured in a fruit jar, every weed, every worm, every bushel. Willa wrote to Dr. Colson. And Dr. Colson, who by then had been pulled into the government's new Soil Conservation Service, wrote back with a sentence Willa underlined 3 times. "What you and your father are doing on that farm. Miss Harper is the future of this country, if this country is to have a future on the plains at all." The summer of 1935 was the cruelest yet. Black Sunday in April. No rain worth the name until August. All across Oklahoma, the last holdouts gave up. The county that had laughed at Willa Harper was a county of empty houses and buried fences, of drifts that swallowed whole barns. And in the middle of it, on a farm everyone had written off, a strange green patchwork held on. The stubble-listed sorghum came up through the dust drifts and kept coming. The cowpeas and clover, planted into ground that hadn't been turned in 4 years, spread over the worst acres like a slow green tide, their roots going down and down, stitching the soil back into a body. When the August rains finally came, an 1.5 inches over 2 gentle days, the Harper farm drank every drop. Willa walked the fields the next morning and found the moisture 10 inches down, cool and dark, held like water in a cupped hand. Her father walked with her. He didn't say much, but at the far corner of the east field, where the gullies used to start, he knelt down, slow, on his bad knees, and worked his crooked fingers into the soil and brought up a handful and smelled it. It smelled like coffee grounds. It smelled alive. "Well," he said, and then, after a moment, "Your granddaddy would have run me off the place for this." "Your granddaddy," Willa said, "never saw the sky turn black at noon." Elias Harper laughed. It was the first time she'd heard him laugh in 3 years, and it came out rusty, like a hinge that hadn't been used. But it was real. The harvest of 1935 was the harvest that made Washita County. What was left of it? Stop Laughing Forever, the old 40, in its 4th year without a plow, made 31 bushels of corn equivalent to the acre in the driest year in recorded history. The East 140 in its first full season under Willa's system made 26. The county average among the few farms still operating was 9.9. Willa's fields outproduced the county average nearly 3 times over. When the government men came through that fall, and they did come in their dusty Chevrolets, with their cameras and notepads, they stood at the Harper fence line and wrote down numbers they didn't entirely believe. And one of them, a young man from the Soil Conservation Service, asked Willa if he could take her picture for a report to Washington. She said yes, on one condition, that the report say the ideas came from a book and a college man named Dr. Henry Colson, and from the soil itself, which had been trying to teach people for 10,000 years. The young man wrote that down too. On the last day of October 1935, Willa Dean Harper and her father rode into Cordell in the wagon, and Willa walked into the First National Bank with a canvas bag containing $1,140. The note in full, with $40 to spare. Earned from 40 acres. Everyone had called a junk pile and 140. Everyone had called a graveyard. The banker counted it twice. He stamped the note PAAD and slid it across the desk with the particular reverence of a man who has stamped very few notes PAAD that year. Elias Harper folded the paper and put it in his shirt pocket over his heart. He didn't speak until they were back on the wagon, rolling west into a sunset, the color of ripe wheat. Then he said, 4 years ago I told you not to make a spectacle of this family. I remember. Papa, you made a spectacle, he said, just not the kind I feared. Word travels in a county the way water travels in soil, slowly, then all at once. By the spring of 1936, the men who came to the Harper fence line weren't laughing, and they weren't watching a fire. They were coming to learn. They came with their hats in their hands, the way men come when they've lost everything except the need to understand. They came from Washita County and Custer County and Kiowa, and then from farther, from Kansas, from the Texas Panhandle, drawn by a government report and a rumor that turned out to be true. that a farm in western Oklahoma had stayed green through the worst of it, on the strength of dead plants and standing stubble, and a girl who refused to plow. Willa taught them all. She taught them in her fields, kneeling in the dirt, making them put their own hands in the ground and smell it. She taught them at the church on Wednesday nights, with her notebook and her mother's rain jar records, and a patience she had learned from waiting 4 years to be believed. Some of the men were older than her father. Some of them had called her the weed queen, or worse, and she let a few of them squirm a little before she forgave them, because she was, after all, only human. But she forgave them, because the point was never being right. The point was the soil, the gray, dead, blowing soil of the Great Plains, and whether it could be brought back to life before the people who loved it were all gone. Years later, when the government men had become an agency, and the agency had made conservation tillage a national policy, when no-till farming had a proper name and a science and a future, a journalist from Oklahoma City came out to write a story about the Harper farm. He was young and eager, and he asked Willa the question everyone always asked her, the question she'd been answering since she was 17. How did you know? How did a teenage girl know what the whole county didn't? Willa was 31 years old by then. Her father was still alive, still farming, his crooked hands finally straightening a little now that they no longer gripped a plow. Her mother's rain jar records filled a shelf. The old 40 was the greenest ground in the state of Oklahoma, and the state of Oklahoma knew it. She thought about the question for a moment, and then she gave the answer she'd been saving. I didn't know, she said. I just looked. Everyone else was looking at the crop. I looked at the soil. Everyone else was asking the land what it could give. I asked it what it needed. That's the whole secret, and it isn't a secret at all. The land talks. It talked for 10,000 years before anyone plowed it, and it's been talking ever since. Most folks just don't care for what it has to say. The journalist wrote it down. Then he asked one more question, the question that had followed her all her life, the word that had been thrown at her from wagons and fence lines and church steps. They called you lazy, he said. The laziest girl in 3 counties. What do you say to that now? Willa Harper smiled and looked out over fields that had fed her family through the worst drought in American history. Fields that had paid a banknote nobody thought could be paid. Fields alive with earthworms and roots and dark, sweet-smelling earth. Lazy, she said, is just what tired people call the things they don't understand yet. I never minded the word. I minded the dust. She stood at her fence line as the journalist drove away. 17 and 31, and every age in between, the girl who refused to plow, watching the wind come up out of the west the way it always had, the way it always would. The wind bent the grass and stirred the stubble and moved on across the fields of Washita County. But the soil stayed where it was, because a 17-year-old girl had refused to turn it loose. And in the end, that refusal, that stubborn, scandalous, lazy refusal, fed more people, saved more farms, and taught more lessons than all the straight furrows in Oklahoma ever had the land talks. All you have to do is kneel down, put your hands in the dirt, and listen.